How do you see this going forward in the Bible, this mixed multitude motif? Where does it show up and how does it factor into biblical theology?
Right. I do see it some in Genesis. I was able to peruse your so generously loaned manuscript to me. Thank you. And I see those parallels that you're talking about of Exodus stuff in the family history saga of Genesis. And I used to have a chicken and the egg friendly debate with one of my profs about what comes first, creation or Exodus, right? We mostly talked about the Exodus narrative and Genesis 1 and 2 stuff. And I think that we mostly agreed that the Exodus is paradigmatic, as you put it, because it is the primary kind of like anchoring experience in Israel's history. In history, the Exodus was the defining experience of the religio-ethnic nation of Israel. And therefore, I think they use Exodus as a template for doing all sorts of theology. I do think that the theology of who God is, what creation is, what humanity is, those axioms that you get in Genesis 1 and 2 are theologically primary. I think Exodus is theologically secondary, but I think it's experientially and explanatorily primary, if that makes sense. So I think I think Moses explains theology in terms of the Exodus, but theology is theology. But the Exodus is the template that always gets used. And so when we come into the mixed multitude, that's one instance in Exodus 12 of not Israel joining with Hebrews or Israelites to be God's people. And we can come back to this if you want to. I'll just really quickly sort of do a Cliff Notes summary of my PhD work. There are not a lot of times in Jewish tradition, biblical or extra biblical, there's not a lot of times that this idea of Jews and not Jews joining together to be God's people comes up. But it happens a dozen times. And every time it does happen, it follows the same paradigm, that's the wrong word. I use the word constellation. It uses the same features each time. And it always is brought out as the big gun when an author needs to make a big gun point. It's sort of
Really?
theological, it's sort of the theological principle of last resort. That's why it comes up so seldomly, I would say. So my PhD work is showing that it comes up this one time in Exodus, and this shared time in Micah and Isaiah, and this other time in Isaiah, and this time over here in First Kings, and this time in actually kind of a bunch of times in the Psalter, but I just picked kind of one chunk of time where it happens in the Psalter. And then in the competing versions of Judaism between 400 BC and 200 AD, in those different schools of thought, it pops up another 6 times. And all those competing versions of Judaism don't agree on what the people of God necessarily will end up being or what God is going to do next in history, but they all agree on this theological principle. And then that's my context in my PhD work for looking at what Paul's doing. One of the prompts for me to do that work was oftentimes you'll see Pauline scholars say, Paul's doctrine of salvation is the most important. Paul loves justification by faith, and the idea of being justified by faith leads him to realize that faith is open to Jews and non-Jews alike. And I think that's putting it exactly backwards. I think that's the cart before the horse. I think that Paul is Jewish, just like all those other examples I just gave. And Paul is starting with the big picture idea that God's trying to get all of humanity back to being the people of God as much as he can. That's the fundamental goal. And Jesus is starting to do that, Paul being a Jesus-following Jewish person. And then Paul goes off for a decade or more and starts to figure out how is God going to do that. And that's where he starts to realize the doctrine of justification by faith. That's how God's going to do it. So that's my PhD work. So if there's a whole bunch of, not tons and tons and tons, but a whole bunch of big gun moments in Scripture and even outside of Scripture that Jews kind of standardly say, yeah, God's big picture plan is to rehumanize humanity, using the people of Israel to get as many people into the people of God as possible. That's why it's unremarked upon when you see that happening as one of those moments in Exodus 12. When the sons of Israel, when the Hebrews finally successfully come out of Egypt near the end of the Exodus cycle of chapters 3 to 14, they bring with them, like you said, stuff that gets foreshadowed and echoed even in Genesis. They bring with them the plunder of gold and treasures, and they bring costly garments and much livestock, and also a mixed multitude. Well, the author doesn't need to stop. The narrator doesn't need to stop and say, now let me explain to you what a rich garment looks like. He doesn't need to stop and say, now let me tell you about cattle. Because you'd go, duh, I know what cattle are. And if you're a good scriptural student, if you're a good biblical theology student who knows the axioms of theology according to the scriptural tradition, then when the mixed multitude gets mentioned, you also don't need to stop and explain that, because duh, we all know that that's God's endgame. So the mixed multitude is sort of as mundane as garments and cattle, in the sense that everybody already knows the referent of that. It doesn't need to be paused and explained.